My programs of late have been kind of a combination of myth-busting and rant, and one of the things I like to start with is my favorite definition of economics. It is the science of explaining tomorrow why the predictions you made yesterday didn't come true today. This is why we are grateful for meteorologists, because they are worse at this than we are. So I particularly enjoy speaking to groups that have problems with short-term memory. So if I come back later, you're like, I didn't say that. So we will talk a little bit about what to expect. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the things that kind of permeate the media during an election year. You may have noticed we're in an election year. One of the most interesting statistics about the election year: sales of TiVos and DVRs skyrocket during election years. It is the only conceivable way to avoid these people. So it is been good for that part of the industry anyway. This is kind of the media depiction of the U.S. economy. It's kind of like, the good news is we may have hit bottom. There's some truth to this, but honestly, it's kind of overblown. And there's things that become truisms, I guess, about the U.S. economy that really aren't true. And as mentioned in the intro, I do a lot of work with manufacturers. And this is probably one of the most myth-laden sectors of the U.S. economy. There is an assumption, it's been going on for years, that we no longer make anything, that we are a country that doesn't make products, we don't have manufacturing anymore, we don't have industrial production, it all comes from China, and all we do is push paper and spend on things made elsewhere. That's not true. The U.S. accounts for 40% of global manufacturing by value. China accounts for 10%. We are 4 times larger than China as a manufacturing nation by value. China makes the junk we buy in Walmart. We make the machines the Chinese use to make the junk that make in Walmart. We make airplanes. We make road building equipment. We make sophisticated products. We're one of the world's leading manufacturing nations. The only country that comes close to us is Germany. They're the other 40%. And then the rest of the world divides up that 20%. So we continue to be a powerful manufacturing nation. 1 out of every 7 jobs in the United States is dependent on manufacturing or is in manufacturing. You are constantly seeing references to how few people are in manufacturing, but that is an accident of how it's counted. So you're not counted as a manufacturer unless you're actually standing behind a machine. Like the other 600 people that are in the company don't count. Like, what's the payroll clerk going to do if you don't have people making something with the machine? All those people are employed by manufacturers. The sector alone, if you pulled it out of the U.S. economy, would be the 8th largest economy in the world. So it is a huge part of the United States. Other myths that sort of permeate the nation: that there's no economic growth taking place, that there's no hope for the future, that it's all going to come to a crashing halt any minute now. Well, the fact is we're a huge country, and this is one of my favorite ways to show this. This is a map of state GDPs compared to national GDPs around the world. It's kind of startling that Texas has the same sized economy as Russia. It probably has as many nukes. Then you look at California, it has the same sized economy as Italy, and somehow that figures. So we're really a nation of nations. I mean, all by ourselves, we account for a vast percentage of the U.S. GDP globally. I mean, the U.S. is the largest economy in the world. We have an economy of $16 trillion. A lot of conversation about China catching up at some point or surpassing us at some point. It's going to be a while. China has a GDP of about 12 trillion. So they've got a ways to go, and they're not growing any faster than we are right now. And we'll come back to China off and on, but just as an example of how we can get skewed data. We look at China, we see that they're growing at 7%, 7.5%. We're like, wow, that's really fast. Boy, we're only growing at 1.5%. They're growing a lot faster than we are. Here's the problem. In China, 6% growth is recession. This is a country that needs to generate 1,300,000 jobs per month just to keep up with population growth. If they fall below 6%, they're in recession. So their 6% is our 0. So if they're growing at 7.5, that's 1.5% growth. We're growing at 1.5. We're literally growing at the same rate. The two countries are paralleling in terms of their own economic development. And China is facing the challenge of being on top for a while. This was the major manufacturing nation globally for consumer goods because it was the low-cost producer. Those of you in business know what happens to low-cost producers. Who are you vulnerable to? The next low-cost producer. If you're producing on the basis of price, you're vulnerable to that next competitor. That's what's happening to China. I was in a Chinese hotel a few months ago, one of these mammoth business hotels that has a lobby that's like 12 times the size of Edwardsville. I mean, it's just huge. And I can see this commotion going on at one end of the lobby, but I can't really see what's happening until it gets closer. And it turns out that there's 4 or 5 guys in suits that are being chased out of the lobby by Chinese police. And what essentially was happening is they were flinging business cards at people's tables as they were running by. And they were Vietnamese. And they were saying, "You doing business in China? You come Vietnam. We're better. We cheaper. We smarter." And the Chinese were like, "Get out of our hotel." So they're losing business to Vietnam. They're losing business to Indonesia. They're losing business to India. They're losing business to other countries that are doing to China what China did to the countries they replaced. That creates a dilemma. The Chinese now have to figure out a way to compete with the companies in the US and in Germany and Japan, and that's a whole different combination of skills. Mentioned again in the introduction, I'm the economist for the Fabricators and Manufacturers. We have a big trade show every year, and last year we were in Chicago, and this is a great opportunity to see what's happening in the manufacturing world. And setting up right across from our booth is a booth from China and a booth from Germany, and they're both selling press brakes. And the Chinese are very excited because their press brake looks exactly like the German press brake, even the same color as the German press. It's like, for God's sakes, could you just, paint it a different color? So it's a third less than the German machine, and the Chinese are waiting to clean up. 3 days, 26,000 people came through that show every single day. For 3 days, not one person in the Chinese booth. The German booth was packed. And so after a few days, the Chinese guy comes over and says, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, ask somebody." So he goes up to this guy wearing a set of overalls, runs a little job shop in Mississippi, and he says, "Why are you not coming in my booth?" He says, "Our machine is just like the Germans." It's like they're now admitting that they completely copied it. And he goes, "Son, how long you been in business?" He says, "I'm a job shop. I don't got marketing. I don't got ads. I don't got nothing. I got my reputation. When somebody orders a part from me, that part shows up exactly when I say it's going to. Because if it doesn't, they're going to go to the next job shop. I mean, we're all the same. We're just making stuff out of sheet metal." German machines, by this time, Dieter has walked up. He says, "Dieter, how long you been making that machine?" "We have been making this machine for 150 years." And it's like, and he just says, the German machine never, ever, ever, ever breaks down. Never at all. When you're around for 100 years, come back and talk to me. I'm not going to invest the life of my company into a machine I don't know. And that's the challenge the Chinese have. Even if it's the equivalent of the German machine, they don't have the reputation. They don't have the reputation we have. They don't have the reputation Japan has. They don't have the reputation that Germany has. And that will be one of their challenges going forward. These are the issues, apparently, that voters are most concerned about according to polls. Top of the list, not surprisingly, is employment. And then after that, there's some fluctuation week to week. But you get two things like threat of recession in 2013, economic uncertainty, both of those kind of wrapped around the fiscal cliff thing. Then you've got the debt issues, and sometimes that's a real concern, sometimes it falls back a little bit, kind of depends on what people's mood is. Then you end up with things like consumer confidence, trying to figure out what the consumer is thinking. And we're kind of going into a period right now where all of us can play economists because we can watch what the consumers do in the next 2 or 3 months. This is the time of year. Step one was back to school sales. These went off pretty well, much better than last year, kind of comparable to where they've been in the past. Very different from back to school in my day. I mean, I'm looking at a bunch of grade school kids all standing out there with laptops, and I'm like, really? I had to buy a protractor every year. Never learned how to use one, never knew what they were for, but not too many years ago, I opened up a drawer and I had like 20 of them, and they're all different colors, and you know, it's like, hey, so if there's ever a protractor shortage, I'm ready. But it was a good season. Now we're coming into Halloween. Halloween is the second largest spending holiday in the U.S. calendar. The average person spends $350 on Halloween. If you are not one of those people, look to your left, look to your right. One of those people has the inflatable in their front yard. So it is estimated that at the end of this month, on October 31st, 1,700,000 Americans will be in some kind of costume or another. That's 2/3 of our population. I used to kind of wish that if the aliens ever did land, they would land on that day. And would just be terrified and go back home. It's a big holiday. We're going to be able to track to see if it is as successful as it was last year. By all indications, so far it has been. A lot of spending on decorations. It's now an adult holiday. Then we go into the two big ones. This is Black Friday and Black Friday weekend. Professional shoppers, women, go out after Thanksgiving and do what the economy requires of them. And they're the ones that are going to show up at 3 o'clock in the morning for the sales. But then, the critical last 2 days before Christmas, when the American mail saves Christmas. And we do this every year, and we do it the same way. Retailers have tracked this. They know that 80% of what men buy in the last 2 days before Christmas is returned. So they bring all of the junk they have forward and they stick it in the front of the store because men won't go more than about 100 feet into a store. And so we see something and we buy it. If you go to the malls the last 2 days before Christmas, it's entirely male. They all have deer in the headlight look, and if you're a man carrying a bag, other men will begin to follow you. It's kind of like, you scored, you know. So you have this moment when men are diligently trying to figure out what to do for members of their family. I learned this valuable lesson a number of years back. I'm shopping the last day before Christmas, as I always do, and here's this beautiful table of sweaters. I'm like, outstanding, I've gotten lucky. 2 sizes, extra, extra small and extra, extra large. So I pick one up and the guy next to me says, son, you don't want to be making that statement. So I put it down and I got the extra, extra small and I took it back to my wife and she said, oh, honey, and took it back after Christmas and exchanged it for a sweater that cost 4 times more than what I had paid. Thus, men saving Christmas. Women spend, on average, 4 to 5 times what was spent on them with the goods that they are bringing back. And, you know, men have tried to use the gift card, but nothing says, I love you, I've been married to you for 20 years, more than a plastic card saying, I have no idea what you want. It's just kind of like, really? It's like, so glad you're following all the hints. So that and the fact that men have the most atrocious taste in perfume of any creature on the planet. And Estee Lauder did a study a number of years ago trying to figure out what men actually liked so that they could, develop a perfume that would just be magnet for men. They never got very far with it because the top 3 smells were motor oil, new car smell, and cinnamon rolls. So if you want to entice your man, a little 10D40, a couple of honey buns on your head, and you're ready to go. So we're a tragic gender. You've got things like crisis in Europe, which is weird. Most of the times Americans don't pay much attention to the rest of the world. We're still not really sure why we're worried about Europe. We just are. We've got issues around housing, but that's starting to look decent. The housing numbers are improving. Data came out just today indicating that new home sales are back to where they were 5 years ago. So you're now seeing quite a bit of activity. Again, very regional. You can have parts of the country that aren't going to see a housing recovery for decades. I mean, Clark County, Nevada is not seeing a housing boom. North Dakota, on the other hand, I was talking to people before the session, a Motel 6 rents for $495 a night in Williston, North Dakota. If you want to rent an apartment in North Dakota, in Williston, it is $4,500 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. So these are rents you will find in Manhattan, New York. But geez, North Dakota, well, there's a housing shortage. They're building as fast as they possibly can. Trade disputes, always a big issue during election years. It's all China's fault, and economists try to argue with this, but the politicians will have a field day with this for a while. And then finally, inflation, which is kind of odd. It is not normally something that falls that low, but we really haven't seen the inflationary impact that we were warned about. So the fact that we have not seen what people were promising has made us a little less concerned. Gas prices have started to come down a bit, every place but California, and food prices didn't skyrocket quite the way we thought they would. They may next year, we'll see. If you look at this, this is kind of an indication of where the labor market has been. And it's important to note that we got an improvement and things began to, as far as the unemployment rate is concerned, it peaked at one point and has become a little less of an issue. But the challenge with employment is that the statistics that we use are not great. If you remember a week or so ago, there was wild ecstasy within the press. My God, unemployment has fallen from 8.1 to 7.8. We're saved. And the economists were like, you do realize that's one of the most meaningless statistics we have. It is derived from a thing called the household survey. 600 some odd families are polled every month and asked a critical question. Is anybody working in your household? Sometimes people answer appropriately. Sometimes they're like Clem's out in the back chopping wood. He's working, but that's not what we were trying to count. So, but the major problem is it's a survey. And one of the things that happens during an election year when reporters start to talk a lot about the economy is it's very obvious that they became reporters because they flunked statistics. A survey is only accurate within 3 points either way of the core number. So if somebody says the unemployment rate is 8.1, what it really means is it's between 7.8 and 8.5, somewhere in that range. If the unemployment rate is 7.8, it's between 8.1 and 7.5. 8.1 is common to both of those ranges. It is entirely possible that unemployment changed not at all. We don't know for sure. It's in a range. Maybe it went down. Not absolutely certain. You have to look at a bunch of other stuff. The Conference Board comes up with a thing called the Employment Trends Index, the ETI, and they take 8 different measures of employment and they just track how many of them are up and how many of them are down. And the ecstasy did not extend to the ETI. 5 of the 8 are still trending negative. 3 of them are trending positive. There has not been much of a change in unemployment, and we'll talk a little bit about why. 2 of my favorite ways to track unemployment, at least because they're more fun, one is the toilet paper index. The Institute for Supply Management does the thing called the Purchasing Managers Index, the PMI. You've seen this before. One of the sub-indices for the PMI is the TP index, because we've discovered that when you're hiring more people, you use more toilet paper. When you're firing people, you use less toilet paper. So you can compute how much toilet paper a company is buying or not and know if they're growing. You can also tell if they have more women than men. So very useful. The other index, which is a whole lot more fun to research, is called the Vixen Index and sometimes the Hot Waitress Index. This was developed back in the 1980s in Florida and has been tracking dead accurately for 17 years. And it basically says that the hotter the waitress at Starbucks or your local watering hole, the higher the unemployment rate. When the unemployment rate is low, they get all kinds of cool jobs in corporations, but when it's high, then they have to go to work in the local bar. So There are millions of men now who describe themselves as economic analysts. And it's just like, I am not ogling. I am adding to the well-known Vixen Index. So this is household survey, establishment survey, two of the ways that we look at things. They tend to trend somewhat similarly, but not exact numbers. The establishment survey is where you ask businesses how many jobs they created. The challenge with that one is that it's strictly that. You're not asking whether you hired somebody who'd been unemployed. If you hired the guy that was working across the street, you've added a job, but it was a job he already had. I mean, you didn't take somebody off the unemployment rolls. The other thing is it has a hard time keeping up with temp agencies. I've got a friend who runs one of these. Got a guy named Chuck. Chuck is the computer whiz, and he goes in and fixes things in a day or so for almost any company they choose. Chuck was counted 28 times last month. So it looked like they created 28 jobs. No, they were keeping Chuck busy. You know, it's not necessarily a reliable number. You kind of have to back off a little bit and take some of these things into consideration. Connection between employment and education. We all know it's there, but it's changed. And one of the things we're going to have to come to grips with in the not distant future is the fact that we've put a burden on education that it doesn't quite know what to do with, particularly some of the bigger four-year schools. The top majors in terms of making money, these are things that are going to make you 80, 90, 100 bucks an hour. Starts with economics. So this will not last. I sort of have a new economic indicator now that when people stop asking me to speak, the economy has recovered. So we're obviously still in a difficult situation because I have 65 bookings for next year. But anyway, after economics, accounting, then finance, then engineering, and then mathematics itself. Those are the ones that are going to make you the most money. The bottom five, sociology, social work, psychology, arts and literature, and education. Those are going to make you 10 bucks an hour. There are 10 times more majors in the bottom five than the top five. So you have lots and lots of kids going to school, getting degrees that are not going to make them any money. And this is why the student loan issue has suddenly become so germane. It's okay to borrow $100,000 to go to school if you are planning to be an engineer or an accountant. But if you've staggered out of school with a degree in psychology, you can annoy your friends forever, but you're not going to make a lot of cash. And part of the challenge is that you don't have kids who are prepared. When I still taught, I taught the wheat from chaff class in economics. This was the junior level course where you sort of wanted to make sure that those who went forward were up for the task. My class was a little different than most. First day of class for most classes, got your syllabus, go home. My class started off with an exam that was worth 70% of your grade on day one. So the students were walking in, and it's like, hi, this is a 9th grade math test. If you cannot pass a 9th grade math test as a junior in college, majoring in economics, get out of my class. And I ended up losing 40%, 50% of every year. And I'd have kids coming up demonstrating why it was they failed. Is there any way I can get an A? Son, you got a 70% F. I would say do the math, but that's pointless. This is an actual response to a math test. So, this is what happens when the Where's Waldo generation tries to get a job. So, if you look kind of down the road to economic performance, I mean, you know, this is the fiscal cliff scare, and the whole idea is that if we go careening off the fiscal cliff, we are going to be in big trouble. This is kind of a worst case scenario, which has us in recession for quarter after quarter after quarter. We all kind of know the drill. Last year, Congress kind of came up with this last-minute fudge where they said, we're going to just, by God, make sure that we're going to take this seriously by putting in all these kind of crazy demands. And at the time, I'm thinking, Congressman, You have a $16 trillion debt. It is 110% of GDP. We're running an annual deficit of $1.3 trillion. Is that not enough to make you take this seriously, that you had to play some games? I mean, really. I heard a radio thing the other day about a possible solution would be to outsource Congress. You know, just hire a bunch of guys from India, you know, and it's just kind of like they could not possibly do any worse. So now you've got this thing coming up where if something isn't done, we all get hit with a major tax increase, and the Defense Department in particular is in trouble because the demand was that 10% across the board cuts. They're not even allowed to determine what they want to cut. It's just everything 10%. And the Navy has patiently pointed out that when you only build 90% of an aircraft carrier, you have problems. As one admiral said, it becomes the weirdest shaped submarine you've ever seen. Realistically, a poll of economists taken about a week ago asking what was going to happen with the fiscal cliff, 60% of us demonstrating that we are the most cynical profession on the planet, came back and said, there's going to be a fudge at the last minute, and it'll be 1 minute after midnight of this year, because if you remember, Congress said, we can't change this now that it's in action. You know, we're committed to this. The operative word there is we. They only committed this Congress. No Congress is allowed to commit a subsequent Congress. It's not legal. The second the new Congress comes into effect, it's a whole new ballgame. Otherwise, you'd have Congresses, every time they would change, would pass thousands of pieces of legislation and stick the next guys with it. So they're not allowed to. They can't. So they were accurate. We can't change this. They can. So 1 minute after midnight, the new Congress will sit there and say, well, that was stupid. And we're going to kick this down the road 6 months, a year, 6 years, 6 minutes, who knows, whatever they decide. 17% of us were optimistic and thought that there was going to be some kind of last-minute compromise which actually accomplished something. And then 22% thought that they would be just dumb enough to let it happen and plunge the U.S. into chaos. I tend to go with the cynics. I think it will be another one of those kind of embarrassing moments where we're all looking at these people. This Congress has been the least productive since 1949. It has passed less legislation than the famous do-nothing Congress after the Second World War. So when you go to the polls this year, you know, attach little notes and saying, I'm voting for you, but you're on my list. It's like, please demonstrate that you're doing something.